We continue with our discussion on leadership. We have defined leadership as influence. In other words, a man who is a great leader is a man of a lot of influence. The more you influence, the greater the leadership. So that, and when we talk about influence, we mean an admiration from your followers that causes them to trust you and to want to walk with you to an unknown future. But because they trust in you, they are willing to explore with you to where you are leading them. And then we ask ourselves, what's the benefit of leadership? Number one, it helps a group to operate from where they are to a much better place for their own benefit and for the good of the community. Number two, when there is good leadership, it helps to remove anarchy, where people work without organization. Good leadership will help that the team is organized and the team is going into a direction towards that desired future in a way without wasting time. So they are both effective and efficient. Where there is good leadership, the speed also is better because we are a united team with good influence. They are able to reach where they are going faster than if they had a bad leader. So you can see it's a very useful thing. However, we decided the examples of leadership we want to follow are the ones in the Bible. So we are picking each character. We have picked various apostles. And today, we pick on one less known called James of Alpheus. James of Alpheus. And it's unclear about him. We don't have a lot of information about him. But for Jesus to select him as one of 12 only, it means there was something very important in him and something he wanted to accomplish through him. James, son of Alpheus, was one of the 12 main disciples of Jesus Christ. The New Testament only mentions him in the 4 lists of disciples and always towards the end of the list. In whether you go to Matthew or John, he's always there, indicating he was less important than the others according to the writer. So the writers, because it's not according to Jesus, according to the writer, they may put your name down at the bottom. You know, this same guy, James of Alpheus, is also sometimes called James the Less. And sometimes it's called James the brother of Jesus, I doubt. And if these are all references to the same James, that will make James, son of Alpheus, the author of the book of James. And he is also then will be regarded as one of the 3 men that Paul called pillars of the church, if he is the same guy. Some have also argued that he is the apostle Matthew's brother. Again, we don't have enough information on that. Many modern scholars are more hesitant to make these kind of associations. But one distinction is absolutely clear. James, son of Alpheus, is not the same person as James, son of Zebedee. These are 2 different people. One of Jesus' closest disciples who was martyred in the book of Acts, chapter 12, verse 2. So it's we can see from that introduction that it's unclear who he was and what he did. But you know something? Even if they haven't written much about you, it doesn't make you less of an apostle. The list of 12 will not be complete until you talk about James Alpheus. So even if for you as a person, you are not famous, you can contribute to the cause of the group and the cause of Christ, irrespective of whether you appear at the bottom of the list or at the top. For the truth is, God, who has made you a leader, knows you and actually knows the total impact. Some people that appear, that take a lot of press space, don't accomplish as much as others who don't appear in the press. You know, this listing of 12 of the 12 apostles is critical because they were the critical beginning of the church. Whether you go to Matthew 10, or go to Mark 3, or go to Luke 6, or even go to the list that is put in Acts chapter 1, verse 13. I think it's important to see there is a good enough reason. So anybody appearing on the list should be regarded important. While there are some variations in the order of apostles from one list to the other, even the names they were by sometimes are changed or not the same. James, son of Alpheus, is listed in all of the list. He is never mentioned in the Gospel of John, however, but John never explicitly lists all the apostles either. So it's important to understand we are talking about a real man for all the synoptic gospel writers to list him. This means James, son of Alpheus, was one of the people who was closest to Jesus, and that he spent about 3 years living with Jesus, witnessing the miracles Jesus did, hearing the teachings that Jesus did. And he also saw numerous demonstrations that clearly showed that his master was God. Even though the book of Acts and the epistles never describe James, son of Alpheus, and what he did, he would have been one of the most important leaders of the early church, however. The 12 disciples were regarded as special and very useful in the New Testament times. Sometimes maybe even the credit that will go to James Alpheus may go to somebody else. But you know, the credit of your work going to another does not make it any less valuable. Even if we are mixing up Jameses, and so we give credit to the wrong James, it will not matter, because God, who again is the one who has appointed you, and the people that are benefiting from your leadership know, even if the whole world does not get to know. I'm saying all this in order to say, out of the name Alpheus, it should always remind you that this is a guy who did a lot, but you don't know it. This is a guy who did a lot, but the Bible doesn't write much about it. But he still must have done a lot. So similarly, don't act for the gallery. Do your leadership for the audience of one, God, who can never fail to see, who can never fail to recognize what you have done. But a lot of people waste too much time thinking about, am I getting credit? How come I'm the one who did it and I didn't have the credit? In the process, they don't accomplish as much as they could have accomplished if only they had less interest in this being recognized. So this James, sometimes called James the Less, and or the lesser, or the younger, or the little, and or James the Minor, is mentioned 4 times in the Gospels, always in relation to his brother, to his mother, assuming she is the mother, Mary, whom John referred to as Mary of Cleopas in John chapter 19, verse 25. So he's mentioned. Technically, the moniker the Less is only used once, and it's not very clear why. In Mark 15, verse 40, but really, early Christians use it widely to distinguish. Since there are so many James, we decided how to refer to one James as opposed to we are together. And so when they refer to James the Lesser, they understood what they were talking about. The moniker is ambiguous, however, but it's clearly intended to distinguish the James, this particular James of Alpheus, from James the son of Zebedee, who was one of the most prominent disciples. It could mean he was younger also. Maybe he was younger than the others, or maybe he was even shorter, or even less significant. Whatever the cause for him to be called James the Less, it really doesn't affect his ministry. Some scholars believe the fact that the gospel writers used the lesser here, applied there, implies that the only 2 Jameses they needed to distinguish between. And Jerome, the history writer, and other early Christian writers were quick to identify James the Less as James, son of Alpheus, and James, the brother of Jesus, although Jerome and others argued brothers must be meant cousins to maintain the Catholic idea of Mary not getting a child, but we need to understand that relationship. Maybe your problem is that people have given you a nickname that you don't like. Maybe as a leader, you don't like the way people refer to you. And maybe it's something that is stereotyping because you come from a certain place or because you behaved in a certain place. Or it might be halo effect, what you did the first time you joined the group. I think remind yourself whenever you think about James, son of Alpheus, or James the Lesser, or James the Younger, that the name people refer to you can only affect you if you allow it. Because you know yourself. And you understand it. You know, when I went to Form 1 in the late 1960s, I was small in size. And yet, right from Form 1, I was asked to lead singing for the whole school during the school assembly. So people started talking about, instead of calling me John, started calling me Gachon. I never discovered it until that's what I hear people telling me. Now, later after we left school, they said, did you know so behind your back we used to call you Gachon, or some way of trying to imply I was a younger John. That has not affected my life in any way. It's important to understand that a lot of people waste their life on the basis of what they are called. Sometimes people call you the name they enjoy calling you. Ignore it. What you call yourself, what God calls you, is more important than what people want to call you, whatever nickname they want to call you. So you shouldn't spend too much time on this. James the Younger, James the Less, don't let it intimidate you. You can still accomplish what God wants you to accomplish. One of the key arguments for why James the Less should be identified with James, son of Alpheus, depends on whether or not you consider him an apostle and how you define apostle. Many early Christians reserve the title apostle for members of the 12 or the 70, but in technically just means one who is sent and has been applied to other early Christians. The only conclusion is that Mary, who is described as the mother of James, the Less, therefore the mother of Alpheus, James of Alpheus, was the wife of Alpheus, possibly, and sister of Mary, maybe the Lord's mother. Some news came from the same background. The one who is called by John the Evangelist, Mary of Cleopas. Whatever the story, even the leadership team, you take the group responsibility. It means all of us are involved in it. Now, so believing that we are called together with others, whether they regard us as early or not, I think it will be important. But you see, the critical thing will not be that that James of Alpheus was related to Mary, and that Mary could be related to the mother of Jesus. That would be good to research. But the critical thing is that whatever your background, whatever relationships, he never used them anywhere where you can see he is trying to say, like, the sons of Zebedee wanted to use their mother. No, not son of Alpheus. He was his own man. And I think that's very important. There is a talk about dynasty where the issue is that you are only a leader if you can tell us where your background you came from. To be that totally unfair system, to assume that somebody will be a better leader because his father was a leader, or to assume that because I don't have a background, you don't know who my parents are, I cannot be a man of influence, or to assume that because my father was a doctor and I'm a doctor, I'll be a better doctor. There's no basis for that assumption. And so we are saying it will be important for you to make your own case. Let us benefit from you. Whether your father did well or did badly is irrelevant. Whether your mother made a name or didn't make a name, you have a calling, you have giftings, And you can actually cause the group, the community you are leading, to go places, irrespective of the background you actually come from. You know, this debate about the links of James, there's a difference between James the Less and James the brother of Jesus. Because they are both called James. Jesus had brothers named James, and the other one was called Mark. I think it was called Joseph. We can see this in Mark chapter 6, verse 3, and Matthew chapter 13, verse 55. This James, son of Alpheus, or James the Less, seems to also have a brother called Joseph, according to Mark 15, verse 40. Can you see the likelihood that there can be a confusion about this James? This is why Jerome was so confident all three James could be the same person. Even could be that son of Alpheus is also the brother of Jesus. James' brother, the brother of Jesus, is also called James the Just. The brother of Jesus is called James the Just. This is the person who was the leader of the church in Jerusalem, and is a traditional author of the book in the Bible called James. So therefore it's unlikely that son of Alpheus is the writer of the book of James. Paul mentions him in Galatians chapter 1, verse 19, while describing the visit to Jerusalem. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. So we know there is the Lord's brother, and it's very greatly doubted that he could be at the same time be the brother of Jesus. Now, but since there is some supposition, assuming that he was the brother of Jesus, then that matter is publicly blacked out, surprisingly, because it should have been mentioned very often. And I think it's important to, like I've been saying, to understand that you should not try to, get brownie points because of who your relative is, or who your brother is, or your sister is. Make a name for yourself. Serve God on your own. And I think that will be much better. And I think that's what happened with this son of Alpheus. Some argue that by including this James as one of the apostles, Paul is identifying him as James, son of Alpheus, because apostles usually refer to the 12. James, son of Zebedee, wouldn't have been described as the Lord's brother. And by this point, he had already been, you remember he had actually been martyred. And by default, Paul would be referring to James, son of Alpheus, because the other James we see early in the book of Acts with him being martyred. Paul continued in Galatians chapter 2, recounting a second visit to Jerusalem, where the Council of Jerusalem took place to discuss whether the Gentiles believers should have to follow the law of Moses or traditions that are listed by the book of Leviticus. In Acts, James presided over the council, which James is the issue. Here Paul described him as the pillar of the church, along with Peter and John. James, Cephas, and John, those esteemed as pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, while they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Galatians chapter 2, verse 9. So James is mentioned here. Paul doesn't refer to this James as the Lord's brother again, and he doesn't introduce any other distinction from other Jameses. This likely meant he's discussing the same James, though it's also possible that the James of chapter 2, verse 9 was also well known, that he would have been obvious for the people reading Paul's letter, whom he actually meant. So what are we saying? James the Less, there's a possibility he is James, the leader of the church in Jerusalem. Well, that would be very interesting. You have a bad name, then you have turned out to be the leader. Was he Matthew's brother? another supposition, James isn't the only disciple who is described as the son of Alpheus. Mark chapter 2 verse 14 identifies Matthew, Levi, the tax collector, is also the son of a man named Alpheus too. Levi, the tax collector, is the same person as Matthew the apostle. Most likely, Levi either indicated Matthew was from the tribe of Levi, or Matthew was simply his Greek name. But there's a problem here. There are at least two sets of brothers among the 12, Peter and Andrew. Those are brothers, and they are both apostles. James and John. These are the sons of Zebedee. They are both apostles. And the Bible treats these pairs of brothers differently from Matthew and James. In every list of the disciples, James, son of Alpheus, and Matthew, son of Alpheus, are never grouped together like the other brothers. James is always listed as son of Alpheus, but Matthew never is. And if that weren't enough, the list of disciples explicitly call Simon, Peter, and Andrew brothers, and James and John brothers. But they make no mention of any association between Matthew and James, son of Alpheus. So they are called both of them are called sons of Alpheus. But Alpheus, if it's a location, more than one person could have come from there. Matthew and James, it's unlikely they were brothers. And I think that's a very, very important thing to think about. You see, no one named Alpheus is ever mentioned again, so there's no way of telling the two different Alpheuses. If Matthew and James were brothers, and James, son of Alpheus, was also James, brother of Jesus, then we would have made Matthew the brother of Jesus too. Yeah, I doubt. There's nothing to associate. So it's very unlikely that you can associate Matthew and James. But we read in history that this James, son of Alpheus, became a missionary. All of these apostles were sent to be missionaries somewhere. But since the church has often assumed that James, son of Alpheus, was James the Less, and James, brother of Jesus, were all the same people, where James, son of Alpheus, went get a little fuzzy. If he is James' brother, then he was sent to Jerusalem, where he led the church. But the Orthodox chronicler Nicephorus suggests James, son of Alpheus, wound up in Egypt, in the ancient city of Osrakine. As written in Historia Ecclesiastica 1140. There's no way to be sure where he went, but we can be confident he was sent to spread the gospel somewhere. So apostles were entrepreneurial, and even James Alpheus must have been. What are they calling? We're calling them entrepreneurial. They took risks in order to advance the gospel of Jesus Christ. And they went wherever the unreached people were, irrespective of the risks. No wonder many of them were killed, because they are going to new people who did not want to hear their message. Shouldn't that give us a message as leaders? That if we are really going to be leaders, then we should become the risk takers. The people who go ahead, take the risk on behalf of the group. And of course, we could backfire on us. I think that's something that we need to have clearly in our mind as we talk about James and learn from him. Another question: how did he die? If we connect James, son of Alpheus, with James the Just, the brother of Jesus, then tradition tells us that he was pushed from the pinnacle of a temple where he was preaching, and then beaten with a full axe and stoned to death. In art, James, son of Alpheus, is typically portrayed with a full axe club, reflecting the church assumption that he was the same person as James the Just. However, the tradition which claims James, son of Alpheus, preached in Egypt says he was crucified in the city of Astrakhan. Hippolytus, a theologian who lived in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, allegedly recorded James' death on the 12 apostles of Christ. And James, the son of Alpheus, when preaching in Jerusalem, was stoned to death by the Jews and was buried there beside the temple. Another possibility of his death. This is the same death tradition ascribed to James, brother of Jesus, but scholars have little reason to trust on the 12 apostles of Christ. The text wasn't discovered until the 19th century, and most believe it's pseudographia, writing that falsely claims to be written by someone. If that be the thing, then it means this story is not a story with him. However, clearly, our friend took a risk that led to his death, whichever type of death. And that's one of the things that we don't have among leaders today. We are so risk averse, we are so afraid of taking risks that the team, our group, whichever community you are leading, ends up being slower or not reaching the very level God would have wanted to go, because you need risk takers as leaders. I'm not suggesting foolish risks. I'm talking about calculated risks, and that will be something that we need to talk about. You know, from James, the son of Alpheus, we can be encouraged that our faith in Jesus Christ and obedience to him matters, whether seen by many or not seen by many, whether people think highly of us or think low of us. Though we know relatively little about him, James, the son of Alpheus, is known fully by God and will be honored alongside all the other apostles, even if we don't read much about it. Whether you refer to Matthew 19 or Revelation 21, he'll be among them. James the Less was in no way lesser in God's estimation, irrespective of the name he was given. The same is true of all who faithfully follow God, like you and me. Whatever God argues about us is what is the truth, not what people think. Other notoriety holds little value in God's kingdom. Rather, faithfully for each one of us, following God and living for God's glory, for his grace, for his project and mission, is what will make us great in God's kingdom. My prayer is that we are going to become like James, people that are going to obey God. There are 3 major lessons we have learned from James. One, that you don't have to be famous for you to accomplish God's work. That God can use you even if nobody writes about you. That we should not start thinking in terms of how wonderful we are because our names are well known. Some of the best known people may have very little impact, may move their community to a lesser degree than people that are known. There are people, number 2, there are people who work from the background. And you can be a leader who doesn't front yourself. You work from the background. You have an influence in your group. Yet the title is given to somebody else and it doesn't bother you. The critical thing is you are called to move the group is moving, even if in name they have another leader who may not be accomplishing much. And that's something that we ourselves need to understand. Number 3, I think it will be important to understand that the name and title you are given has very little power. Are you James the Less, James son of Zebedee, James wherever? It really doesn't matter what they call you. God can use you irrespective of the name people call you and accomplish his purposes irrespective of the name God calls you. May we serve God in every way.